So, welcome to Devfest Melbourne. I am so thrilled to be here today. We had a lot of thanks to sponsors today, which is fantastic, but I think there's a group of people that we missed. So please join me in giving a round of applause to our organizers, because they've done a fantastic job. So it's a privilege and an honor to be your keynote speaker today. And today I want to talk to you about something that's near and dear to my heart. It's kind of the emotional journey that we go on as software engineers. You know, as time goes on, mental health is becoming more of an important topic. And whilst this isn't specifically around mental health, this is, I think, a contributing factor. I'm always really excited when I have something new. When we start a new career, when we start a new job, when we start a new project. And that project can be small. It could be maybe putting in some performance optimizations to a specific piece of code. Or it can be something totally grand, greenfield development, something we haven't built before. But I'm always really, really pumped up to be a part of that. Newness excites me. Privately, or on my personal side, I'm a father, a proud father of two young boys, 7 and 3, almost 4. And one of the things that I love to do for my boys is read to them at night. And so whilst I wanted to share this emotional journey, we're going to do some story time to start with one of my kids' favorite books. It's called Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. And I promise it's relevant to this talk. So, congratulations. Today is your day. You're off to great places. You're off and away. You have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes. You can steer yourself in any direction you choose. You're on your own and you know what you know, and you are the person that can decide where to go. Oh, the places you'll go. Now, as a software engineer, you can today build your apps in so many different places. You can build it for the web, if you're a web developer. You can go for your mobile platforms, Android, iOS. And then we have our server-side infrastructure in the cloud, where we can build scalable applications that can reach users and perform quickly all over the world, in any language that we need to reach them in. We also have emerging platforms like Google Assistant, and Alexa, and Siri, and others. Now, these are interesting. The emerging platforms are quite interesting too, because for the first time now, we have user interfaces that are not visible. We're talking to our computers purely with voice. And that's an interesting challenge as software engineers, because we've always been used to providing a screen, even if it was a terminal back in the day. And we are starting to see some of these assistants evolve into displays again to have a few more visual interfaces. But I think voice is here to stay. And it's an interesting journey that we're all about to take as we start to explore these sorts of platforms. So when you're starting off with something new, you may pick one of these platforms. These are typically the places where we build our applications today. And you may be familiar with one of these or more of these. Once you know your platform, it helps you kind of narrow in on a programming language. And today, in this day and age, we often know more than one language. It used to be, when I first started in this industry, that you could be a C++ engineer and that core skill set could be your day job on like every day. It could take you actually very far. But these days, we tend to be a little bit more multifaceted. And programming languages kind of come and go. But they sometimes come back too. So Python is right there in the middle. Python and Perl had this intense competition 15, 20 years ago, where communities, you were either Team Python or Team Perl. And it turns out that Python actually ended up kind of being more widely adopted on the server side after Perl's initial surge. It also turns out that Python actually dipped for a couple of years in between. Just about a month ago, I read the latest reports that came out around the top programming languages. Turns out Python has had a massive resurgence. It's broken through back into one of the top 5 programming languages. Can anyone tell me why? Machine learning, exactly. It turns out that Python is a great place if you're writing machine learning-based applications. TensorFlow, obviously, one of the most popular frameworks around that, has helped. But it doesn't matter what languages you just started with. As we go on, as we to begin that new journey, we then choose what's familiar to us. And those familiarities can hang around for a while. We then choose our favorite tools. If you're an Android developer, it's likely that you're using Android Studio. And you'll notice that the user experience, the developer experience there, has continued to improve. Chrome Dev Tools help us build responsive websites, and we can test that our websites scale appropriately, whether it's a phone, a tablet, desktop, and so on. And then even editors, like who would have thought text editors would be such an area for such innovation and excitement as they are today. Sublime Text has had a reputation for being this snappy, kind of really simple to use text editor. And then in the last 12 months, if you look at the success of Visual Studio Code, it's a fantastic editor with so much extensibility, supports pretty much any programming language you can throw at it, and has many IDE-like features. There's also those of us that continue to love the command line, and that's cool. If you're you don't need to be able to read that, by the way, it's there for illustrative purposes. If you're a Vim or an Emacs user, then that's still cool. Those tools are still relevant. By the way, I'm on Team Vim, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about that after this. The point is that as we now have these, like I mentioned cloud earlier, as you go to deploy those applications, as you need to debug on a running production machine, the command line is still incredibly useful and incredibly versatile and is relevant to this day. And it will stay relevant. Once we've chosen our tools and editors, we now move on to libraries and SDKs and APIs. Because we all have our favorites, things that give us some convenience, things that take off the heavy lifting for us. I've chosen Firebase here just, again, as an illustrative example because, frankly, Firebase contains quite a lot there, whether it's push notifications or analytics or real-time databases where you want to write some data locally to a device and have it sync through the cloud to all the other devices using that information. And then we have Git. We all love Git. We all hate Git. Let's be honest. Git is amazing because it allows us to develop software in a way that's distributed worldwide. We don't just have snapshots of code on our machines anymore. We have entire repositories. And I think it's amazing how flexible Git is in that regard, but it's also really hard to learn. Its command line interface is quite obtuse. And for those of you that are Git experts, that's amazing. But for someone that's starting off, picking up something new, I think Git still really benefits from having a fantastic visual interface to go with it. When I first started in the industry, I used to use a tool called Microsoft Visual SourceSafe. Has anyone used that? Oh, wow, awesome. That's way more hands than I expected, actually. So for those of you that haven't, with Visual SourceSafe, before you started to work on any code, you used to have to know which files you're going to change, and you used to have to check them out. Right? And checking out a file in the Visual SourceSafe context meant that you were the only person that could modify that file. Once it was checked out, it was exclusively locked to you. So if you were working with other people, I'd have colleagues come to me and say, hey, Ankur, you've got this file checked out. How long are you going to be? And I said, probably 3 days. I'm working on something pretty big right now. And she might say to me, oh, can you just uncheck it out so I can put some changes in? And of course, the process of doing that was actually quite difficult because I had to have to stash my own changes and so on, and then do those merges. And of course, also committing code, checking code back in, you couldn't actually do it in one go. You'd have to check in each of those files kind of one by one. There was no way to kind of group things properly, and people ended up building tooling around it. Compare that to what we have today, where you may be writing some code that's built on some code written by someone you don't know on the other side of the world. Git really helps us solve many of these interesting challenges. So we're on our way. We've done this. We started this new project. We've chosen our platform. We've chosen our language. We've started to pick some tools. Now we want to reach users. We want to put it out there. And we're really spoilt for choice in this day and age. We have the web, billions of users, and frankly, anyone that's connected to the internet has access to a web browser. It doesn't matter what device they're connected with. And that's the real strength of the web, that you can reach users. They don't have to install anything. They just go to a URL that you give them, and they can experience whatever it is you're building immediately. But then we have our native platforms that give us very deep native APIs and capabilities that may not be available on the web just yet. And these are also multi-billion destinations, multi-billion user destinations, like Google Play, like the App Store. And then finally, you have emergent platforms. I mentioned voice assistants. So the Google Voice Assistant is already at hundreds of millions of users of reach. Now you have a way to distribute software that's kind of different to the way you did it before. For those of you that have used Google Homes or used them frequently, you'll notice that you can do things like say good morning to it, and it executes its good morning routine. By default, it sort of tells you the time, the weather, maybe about your schedule and so on. But you can actually put in those routines, you can have it do other things for you, fetch the news from your favorite news source. And as a developer, that presents an opportunity. You could be that news source that users are looking for. And it's a different way to think about reaching users because they have to want to choose you. But once they do, you can reach them every day as part of their daily routine. So we have our distribution methods and mechanisms. So if I was to just put all that together and summarize it in the things that developers do, I would do it in a way like this. This first one, I don't believe is at all controversial. This is the first thing that all of us need at every waking moment: Wi-Fi. We can't seem to live without Wi-Fi. We need to know if somebody's messaged us, if somebody's emailed us, what's happening in the world today. But of course, once we have connectivity, we can then start to do our work. We choose our platform or operating system, which helps us narrow in on the set of languages that are relevant to us. And then we go about with libraries and frameworks, and we go for distribution, and it's all aided to us by our tools that help us get there, things like Git and editors. So that's great. We've picked up a new project. We have some confidence in us. We know what we want to do. We're on our way. Except things don't always work out. Story time. You'll be on your way up. You'll be seeing great sights. You'll join the high flyers who soar to high heights. Except when you don't. Because sometimes you won't. I'm sorry to say, but sadly it's true, that bang-ups and hang-ups can happen to you. You can get all hung up in a prickly perch, and your gang will fly on. You'll be left in a lurch. You'll come down from the lurch with an unpleasant bump, and chances are then that you'll be in a slump. And when you're in a slump, you're not in for much fun. Unslumping yourself is not easily done. And that happens to us. We get off with this enthusiasm and excitement of the things we know. Oh, it looks like that image didn't render. Okay. It's a sad face emoji, by the way. It's not meant to be a sunrise, because maybe I should pay attention to what you're seeing too. I don't know what's happening there. If it happens again, I'll refresh. Anyways, back to sadness. Stop being so happy. It happens, right? Like we move on, we get excited about something, and then we hit some sort of slump. I'm going to talk to you about one of the things that I think in our industry leads us to this slump, and then talk to you a little bit about how I think I like to overcome that slump. I'm going to start off by talking about a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus, who had this quote from a long time ago: "Everything changes and nothing stands still." And I say a long time ago because it literally was, and also in a very wide time frame, 535 BC to 475 BC. He wrote this, but it turns out we weren't very good at record keeping back then, so they're not sure when exactly he wrote it. Now, you might not be familiar with this phrase. It's been paraphrased lots of times over the years. You may know it, recognize it today as something we often say, that the only constant is change. Or change is the only constant. That's how we know of it today. And in this industry, we are constantly changing. We are constantly evolving. And each of those things we feel like it requires some of our attention. So when we evolve, when something new comes along, we feel like, oh, you know what? I have this core skill set in web development or Android development, and this new thing, this new library has come out, or this new piece of technology has come out, and I'm not involved in it. I'm not in that space. This can lead to one of those things that pull us down into that slump, as described in the book. FOMO, or, as I say, the fear of missing out. We feel like, oh, what's that thing that's happening there? Why am I not involved in that? Why is the grass greener on the other side? I'm doing this thing that I know how to do, but it looks like all the cool stuff is happening on that side of it. And it leads us in that slump. It leads us in that, should I be doing it? Why am I not doing it? I wish I could do it. In our industry, people have light bulb moments all the time. Sometimes it's a mere shower thought that you go, oh, I know how to solve that thing. You come into work and you work with your colleagues, and sometimes you just find that that shower thought wasn't a great one. It fizzled out. Occasionally what happens is that people spend a lot of time letting that idea grow in their minds, and they come in and they start to rally behind these efforts. These tend to become more long-term efforts. And eventually that rallying cause grows and grows, and the industry starts to rally around it. But just because more and more people are rallying behind it, just because you hear more of it, doesn't mean that it's a sure bet. And whilst the feeling of FOMO can be real, the actual missing out part isn't always. And I'm going to start by giving you some examples. Who remembers Google Glass? Yeah. I remember when Google Glass was announced, there was a promo video, and once some of these devices started becoming available, like one, it hit sort of the consumer news very quickly. But even us in the tech industry, people were proud of grabbing Google Glass and taking selfies, and all their portrait. Everybody knows someone whose portrait profile had Google Glass in it, right? Everybody knows someone. There was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm that we managed to pack in like a mobile computer, basically, into a form factor that size, and it used to display some relevant contextual information in front of us. It seemed like the next big thing, augmented reality. And we still hear augmented reality today, or hear of. I'm going to give you another example, virtual reality. Now, VR is also in a different space where, like, I don't consider augmented reality or virtual reality, I'm not calling them as failed pieces of technology. But I can tell you now that the excitement and enthusiasm that there was in the industry around VR 2 years ago, or even 18 months ago, it's certainly waned. And it's waned because I think, particularly with virtual reality, it has some interesting requirements. As developers, we need to, or game developers in most cases, we need to build games that are highly performant, and suddenly they're rendering 2 screens at the same time at a really high frame rate. For people that want to buy the device and actually engage with virtual reality, they need a lot of physical space. How much space can you give up in your house for the odd piece of entertainment? And it's quite fatiguing too to engage with it. It's not that these technologies themselves are failures, it's that they fail to kind of find that mass market. So whilst the potential for both augmented reality and virtual reality has always seemed immense, the actual reality for developers to be able to make some money, to actually run a business on them, that has yet to, I would say, realize. So this is an example. I knew lots and lots of developers that were wanting to jump into building apps for Google Glass, game developers that were wanting to build stuff for virtual reality. And I also knew a different set of developers that were like, I'm not doing it today, and I feel like there's something big here we're on the cusp of something big, and I'm really missing out. These developers were in that slump. They were down. They had that fear of missing out. I'm going to present to you something that you typically see in like business school type material, but I think is really relevant to us. And it helps me to contextualize this feeling that we have and how we can overcome it. It all comes down to, in some ways, what I call risk and your risk aversion. Each of us have a certain level of risk aversion. Some of us are risk takers, We want to dive right into something that's new and bleeding edge. And some of us are like, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to see how it pans out. So you may have seen this type of diagram in the past. It's around the technology adoption lifecycle, and it basically says that there's 5 categories of consumers that are out there. And you get these sort of innovators, who's that first group, the people that put on Google Glass and took those selfies and used them as portraits. The buzz was very high. You move on to things like early adopters, and I think this is where VR is at today, where we have some consumer products. There is some success there, but certainly we haven't got to that stage where the mass market of people exists. And that gap that you see in the middle is called the chasm. This particular diagram, by the way, this whole concept is from a book called Crossing the Chasm. And it's really about how do you get from this small user base to suddenly a large user base. They call it a chasm because a lot of products fail to make that jump. Now, if I switch this around from consumers to developers to us, we all we fit this mold as well. When a new piece of technology comes out, things like voice assistants, and there's SDKs or tools there for us to be able to build against them, we start to think of ourselves as to where should we slot in here. And you do get developers that are willing to take that risk early on. They're those innovators that are like, you know what, I don't know where this is heading, but I'm willing to try it. I'm willing to take the risk. I'm willing to invest, and I'm okay with failing. If you're a risk taker, you need to be okay with failing. In tech, we often say that we want to fail fast, and that's an example of it. If you're going to fail, experiment, but fail as quickly as you can, because then you can move on to the next thing. If you've invested a lot of time and energy in something, and then you fail, you feel much worse, and probably your business has been hurt as well. Then some of us are a little bit more risk averse. So an example of the classes of developers I'll say here is, we heard Brendan call out Kotlin. Kotlin is a programming language that Google sort of embraced as a first-class programming language for Android developers last year. And the explosion of interest in Kotlin is just being huge. It's not that Kotlin was new then. Kotlin had been around for a number of years at that point. I didn't do this for dramatic effect, by the way. Kotlin had been around for a number of years at that point, but it was those innovators and early adopters that chose to experiment with it. They found that they were more productive with it, but they also had some challenges. And now, folks like me, who I kind of slot myself in late early adoption or early majority type folks, where I'm like, I know that it's going to hang around. I know that when I build my software on this stack, it will be supported. And it's continued to get better. And that's how I like to use this framework as a way of thinking about this FOMO, this fear of missing out. Because sometimes it's just our own selves that are holding us back from trying something new, because we don't know where things are going to end up. And I think that this can help you come out of your slump. So, it's time for a story. So you're in that slump. No, that's not for you. Somehow you'll escape all that waiting and staying. You'll find the bright places where boom bands are playing. With banner flip-flapping, once more you'll ride high, ready for anything under the sky. So this helps us get out of that phase of, hey, I'm missing out. But I think that there is a slight variation on this that I want to talk about, which is very prevalent in our industry today. It's machine learning and AI. And machine learning is really a space right now where there is intense interest. And it's amazing. We have a dedicated track to it today at this event. It's amazing to see just how much interest that has been generated. But at the same time, I think it's also accompanied by a lot of hype. There's this high expectation that it solves all the problems. And I think it's because we get some magical experiences so far through the use of machine learning. So I'm going to call out 2 specific ones. In Gmail, have we got any Gmail users here today? There's a few. Sounds like there's a few. Gmail does a pretty good job, I think a really fantastic job, of spam filtering. And it's actually a machine learning model that powers the spam identification. And it's been able to sort of train itself based on very large data sets. And occasionally when a spam mail gets in through your inbox, you still have the ability to say, hey, this thing is spam. And that model learns from what you just said. So it tries to do a better job in the future. That's one example. It's a magical experience because frankly, we all get spam mail in one way or another. And we don't have to be disturbed by it. We can focus on what we want in our inboxes. For the most part, it's hard to catch spam from our friends. And then we have Google Photos. For those of you that use Google Photos, you can go into the app or website. You can search for the word cars or just car on your library. It will automatically bring up all the photos that have cars in them. And that's not because anybody tagged them. You certainly didn't sit down and label all your images as having these features. It's because, again, we have this ML model that's trained to be able to see objects and recognize objects in your photos library. So that's great. We've seen these seemingly magical experiences come out. But unfortunately, whilst this has also fueled a lot of interest in the machine learning space, on the flip side, I see lots of leaders, technical and non-technical, going, hey, we should solve this thing with machine learning, without having a good understanding of the spaces where machine learning really excels at. And I think that leads to more of this FOMO, right? All of us. We're like, well, I'm a developer, I'm not a data scientist, or I haven't yet built up that level of skills with machine learning. I'm interested, but I haven't got there yet. And I think that there is a mismatch between what people expect and the learning curve and how easy it is to apply. And today we're actually going to have, with that whole dedicated track on ML, we're all going to leave here with more information around how best to apply it or successful applications of it than when we came in. But the point is, if all you are looking for is, if all you're using is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And machine learning isn't there to solve all the problems. There's a great set of problems that it can solve. So hype can be good. It pushes innovation and sometimes further simplification, but it can also be something that holds you back. You can waste a lot of time doing it. And then we have things in our industry that continue to stay. If I project a few years down the line, like our skill set of things, because as we grow our skill set, there's things that we leave behind. I'm not saying we forget how to do things, but we spend less time on them. I'm confident that mobile apps and mobile websites are going to continue to be a thing. There's no danger of mobile as a platform going away. When it comes to programming languages, I called out Kotlin earlier. One thing I didn't say is that Kotlin was actually developed by a company called JetBrains. And it turns out that what they wanted to do was make it easier for you to write Java applications in an easy-to-follow syntax. They made it Java compatible. And Android developers started to use it and say, oh, look, this is a much better experience than writing Java code. Obviously opinionated, but there were a lot of these opinions from very highly respected individuals in the community. And it was that drumbeat that started to grow that encouraged Google to eventually adopt Kotlin as a first-class language for Android developers. Switching gears to server-side infrastructure, 10 years ago, it was really hard to convince businesses to take their compute, to take their applications and servers out of their on-site premises and move those into the cloud. Today, it's a much easier conversation because one, there's a bit more trust. We have some good security around it. But more importantly, as our industry's evolved, reaching users all over the world, meeting their demands in terms of like performance and scalability is really important to businesses, and doing it yourself isn't always realistic or cost effective. And so that conversation around this has changed. So if you're in this space already today, don't feel like you're missing out. This is going to continue to grow, and there's a lot here left. There's many years, decades, I'd say, in all of these. One other thing that I think is new, not entirely new, but certainly we're starting to recognize it more, is this concept of data ubiquity, right? When you get your next device, doesn't matter what it is, whatever mobile phone you've got in your pocket, the next device you get, you may change your allegiances to platforms or manufacturers, it doesn't matter. You have an expectation that your experience, that your data will carry across. You have an expectation that it doesn't matter whether you're watching on a TV or listening on a laptop, that your music playlists will be accessible there. You expect that regardless of which device you sign into on Twitter, you're going to have your DMs available, your list of followers and so on, that your data will carry with you. And I think this is particularly important for us as we design our systems to think about how users are going to continue to engage in ubiquitous computing and how their expectations will continue to evolve. Now, technology is constantly evolving. That's a plus and a minus. Technology, languages, and tools, I see them as waves. And as individuals, we have the power to choose that wave that we want to be on. And it's okay if you don't pick a specific wave, because there's always another wave coming. If you get on a wave early on and it fizzles out, you might be one of those risk takers, right? That you got in early and you're like, hey, I had a possibility to get on this wave and surf all the way to shore. It would have looked amazing. Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. That's part of being a risk taker. If you wait for a wave to reach its apex before you get on, perhaps you've missed some of that excitement. Perhaps it's not carrying you as far. And if you miss the wave altogether, just turn around. There'll be another one coming. Pay attention, keep an eye out for that. And I think user interfaces are an interesting example of technological waves. From the very beginning with computers, we've always had keyboards. And then a little bit later, we had mice. And suddenly we had to think about graphical user interfaces and how we design around that. Roughly about 10, 11 years ago, we started to think about touch, right? And how touch interfaces are different to everything else. What's next? Right? We today are starting to communicate with our computers with voice. Maybe gestures are next. I heard a recent podcast where Elon Musk said, hey, he'd love to be able to do some sort of neural transfer and be able to engage in thought. Will it happen? Don't know. But the point is that we're always thinking of the next best thing. So don't be too fazed by it. One thing that stays continuous throughout all of this in our industry is the need for people, the need for connections, the need for us to have support from one another, the need for communities. Because as we embrace and hop on these waves of technology, we need help from one another to be able to ride those waves, to learn how to get on, to have the right tools, the right surfboards, if I want to continue that metaphor. And that's why I'm a proud member of the Google Developer Group. I actually live in Sydney, and I've been a Google Developer Group member for 8 years. I come back every year. I don't necessarily make it to every single meetup, but it's because I see GDGs and Devfest. Like, you all are my people. We have this passion and enthusiasm for technology. That doesn't mean that we're like-minded. And in fact, one of the things I appreciate about GDGs and the type of tech community that we have here is that we have a mix of opinions. We may disagree. I've never really been a serious web developer, but I love speaking to web developers to see how that industry continues to evolve as well. Those views and those opinions are really great. So, to summarize, we're in an industry that's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. That's okay. You can end up where you feel like you're missing out on whatever it is, whatever the new shiny is. However, if you put it in perspective of your own risk profile, if you think about, hey, is this something that I actually want to get into? I think it can help you sort of overcome some of that fear, because at the end of the day, then you're in control of it. You're choosing. If you let one of these waves go, it's okay, because another wave will be just around the corner or right behind you. I'm going to wrap up with the last bit of story time. And will you succeed? Yes, yes, you will indeed. 98.75% guaranteed. So, be your name Boxbaum or Bixby or Bray or Mordecai Ali Van Ellen O'Shea. You're off to great places. Today is your day. Your mountain is waiting, so get on your way. Have a great Devfest, everyone.